Thanks everybody for coming out this evening. My name is Daniel Bennett, and I'm a research professor with the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. The Baugh Center has been around for about 20 years, and the goal of the Baugh Center is to facilitate the development of new businesses and further the goals of established businesses. The free enterprise component of the Baugh Center came online a few years ago through the generous funding of numerous donors. And the goal of the free enterprise component is to become a national leader in the preservation of the competitive free enterprise system through research, teaching, and informing public policy. The Free Enterprise Forum, which is the event that you're at, is one component of our center's activities that allows us to bring in renowned guests to speak on a range of topics that relate to free enterprise, ranging from regulation, innovation, poverty, and today, North Korea. We also host the Confessions of an Entrepreneurship series, which brings in local entrepreneurs to share their stories. And every semester we host the McLean Scholars Group, and I see some of my students from that group this semester. And if you're interested in staying in touch about our center's activities, we'll be passing around a clipboard. If you want to stay informed and be on our email list, sign up and we'll keep you informed of what's going on, and we'll try not to bombard you with emails. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the Departments of Political Science and the Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media departments. I want to thank David Clinton and Sarah Sohn, the respective chairs of those departments, for helping us to promote this event. Our guest today is Barbara Demick, a distinguished journalist of international repute. She has won numerous awards, including Britain's Samuel Johnson Award for Best Nonfiction, the George Polk and Robert F. Kennedy Awards, the Osborne Elliott Prize for Journalism from the Asia Society, the Overseas Press Club for reporting on human rights, as well as the American Academy of Diplomacy's Arthur Ross Award, and Stanford University's Shorenstein Award for the best reporting in Asia. Additionally, her books have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and she was also a fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations. Currently, Barbara is the New York correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, but was formerly head of the bureaus in Beijing and Seoul. Before joining the Los Angeles Times, she was with the Philadelphia Inquirer as the foreign correspondent in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. She lived in Sarajevo during the war in Bosnia and wrote a book about her daily life, Logovina Street, Life and Death in Sarajevo, in a Sarajevo neighborhood. This is the book. It's available for purchase at the back table there. She also spent a number of years in Seoul interviewing North Koreans about their lives, for which today's talk and her book, Nothing to Envy, The Ordinary Lives in North Korea, is based. I first became familiar with Barbara's work when I was in a bookstore, browsing for a bookstore in Hong Kong, of all places, looking for a DVD to watch with my nieces and nephews. I wasn't being a very good uncle because I was looking at the books and happened to come across the book, and the title jumped out to me, so I made a rare impulsive purchase. Once I started reading this book, I just really couldn't put it down and finished in just a couple of days. Barbara just compassionately tells the stories of how the economic and political system of North Korea have affected the lives of real North Koreans with which she's interacted. Last note is, if you are a student and you're here for a class, please remember to sign in with your IDs in the back. And please join me in welcoming our guest, Barbara Demick.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. This is, I'll check the levels. This is kind of an unusual topic to be speaking on when I do give talks on North Korea, and it's usually human rights, international policy. It's unusual to be talking to a business school audience and to be talking about entrepreneurship in a country that has the most undiluted brand of socialism anywhere in the world. Even Cuba has changed. This is really the socialist country, but it also has spawned a lot of entrepreneurs. As some of you might know, North Korea went through a terrible famine in the 1990s that killed off maybe 10, 20% of its population, depending on what parts of North Korea you're talking about. And that famine, oddly spurred this boom in entrepreneurship. North Korea had been a really strict communist country. At the time that China opened up and others, North Korea kept going. They never veered from the true socialist path. But when they ran out of, when the state-run economy ran out of food, people started taking matters into their own hands. In the time I lived in South Korea, I interviewed many, many North Korean defectors about their lives, and many of them had started small businesses. This is probably, being at the verge of starving to death is probably not the best way to start a business. I wouldn't recommend it to your entrepreneurs, but as they say, necessity breeds invention. And I'm gonna read you an excerpt from my book before talking. One of the people in my book, we call her Mrs. Song. I think her real name is Mrs. Hong, but we made adjustments in their names. She was a factory worker in her, I guess, early 60s when I met her, and one of the real true believers in the North Korean system. She loved Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea. She, absolutely believed. She worked, every day in her factory until the point that basically she was kicked out by her boss. For many years, people were going to work in factories in North Korea and they weren't being paid. In fact, their factories weren't working. She was doing textiles and her factory had no materials, no cloth, no electricity. So it was, kind of ridiculous to go to work, but they would, do different things like collect driftwood and garbage and recycle things. They were always keeping busy. And finally, her boss said to her, maybe you should stop coming to work since you're not being paid and your family is starving, and do something to make money. And she was horrified because North Koreans were taught that working in the markets was evil. But her husband died of starvation, her mother-in-law died of starvation, her son died of starvation, and she decided she would start a business. And I will read you this excerpt. This was a strange side effect of the famine. Just when things were hitting bottom, with deaths reaching hundreds of thousands, a new spirit of enterprise was born. The collapse of the socialist food distribution system presented an opportunity for private businesses. It wasn't as though everybody could trek out to the mountains to pick leaves and berries and scrape pine bark. People had to buy their food somewhere, and somebody had to supply it to them. North Koreans needed vendors, fishmongers, butchers, and bakers to fill the gap left by the collapse of the public system. All of it was highly illegal. Kim Jong-il was the second of the family of leadership. Kim Jong-il had taken an even harder line against individual enterprise than his father. In a socialist society, even the food problem should be solved in a socialist way. Telling people to solve the food problem on their own creates egoism among the people, he said in a December 1996 speech, one of the few in which he acknowledged the food crisis. Other than vegetables grown at home, food was not supposed to be sold on the market. To sell rice or any other grain was strictly forbidden. North Koreans considered it illegal and immoral, a stab in the heart of the communist ideology. Any private endeavor fell under the rubric of an economic crime, and the penalties could include deportation to a labor camp, and if corruption was alleged, possible execution. Then again, death was a virtual certainty for people who didn't show some private initiative. A human being needs at least 500 calories per day on average to survive. A person subsisting on a diet made up of what could only be foraged in the woods would not survive more than 3 months. The imminence of death gave reluctant capitalists like Mrs. Song new courage. That's how Mrs. Song became an entrepreneur. She had various businesses. She raised pigs. She made tofu, giving the dregs of the tofu process to feed the pigs. Her most successful business was making cookies. She got a little bit of flour. A friendly neighbor made her an oven. She had enough coal to bake, and she baked enough cookies that she sold them at the market, and she managed to keep her family alive, barely alive, the rest of the family, for many years until she defected. This has actually been the North Korean story for the last 20 years. Markets. And the odd thing is that Kim Jong Un is really, despised as an even worse dictator than his father. Kim Jong Un became leader of North Korea when his father, Kim Jong Il, died in December 2011. But, oddly, Kim Jong Un has been much more open about allowing market activity, allowing people to take matters into their own hands. Under Kim Jong Il, who's quoted in this excerpt, they were constantly closing the markets. And there's this ongoing tension between the political system and the economic system in North Korea. Since I wrote my book, I continued to interview North Koreans who come out of the country, sometimes to work in China. And what I've heard is that basically people still go to factories that are not producing much. Things are not quite as bad as they were in the 90s, but a lot of the factories in North Korea are closed. And the North Korean system, similar to the Chinese system, you belong to a work unit. It's called a danwei in Chinese. It's a danwi in Korean. But you have to be part of that work unit, and that's how you get your salary. It's how you get your rations. And people are forced to report to work, whether they're paid or not. So what people have started doing in North Korea is they actually pay their employers for the privilege of not going to work. It's kind of a reversed system. I'm surprised some capitalists here haven't thought of it. Sorry, my company is unionizing, so we're a bit into that. But they pay for the privilege of not going to work, and then they can take matters into their own hands. And North Koreans are very inventive, and they will chop wood to sell it. They'll collect medicinal herbs in the mountain. They'll make sneakers. I mean, they make drugs too. There's crack is a big deal in North Korea. There's a lot of Breaking Bad activity. A lot of the older women work as porters at the markets. There's very few cars in North Korea outside of Pyongyang. So people will build carts with little wheels, and they'll hire themselves out to help others carry groceries from the market. And what's very interesting about the system nowadays is that it's really run by older women, like this Mrs. Song. Under the North Korean system, the younger men and the younger women have got to stay at their jobs at the market, at their work unit. They can't leave. But the older women are the most dispensable element of society. Who needs women over 50? So they let them not go to work. So as a result, they're the ones who are running the market, and they're pretty much running this economy in North Korea, this gray market economy. I mean, the big trading is still done by men, military guys who are connected to the state-owned enterprises. There's a lot of that kind of trading going on, but the private activity is really what's driving things. So I'm going to show you a video of life in a market in North Korea. This video is some years old, but I don't think it's changed that much. And there's a couple things you'll notice.
It is rare to see pictures of North Korea taken without official minders guiding the cameras. North Koreans are especially squeamish about anybody photographing their markets. Maybe that is because they're ambivalent about the capitalist activity in what is still a communist country. A human rights group shot this video of a market in Jongun on a rainy day last year. The camera was hidden in a bag, so the footage is very jerky. But as far as I know, this is the most detailed footage ever to come out of a North Korean market. By the standards of North Korea, there's an amazing variety of merchandise, at least for those who can afford to buy it. Fresh vegetables of all kinds, and pots and hardware. Here are what appear to be 88-pound sacks of rice from the United States. This rice is supposed to be humanitarian aid, but somehow it finds its way illegally to the market. The United Nations, which distributes this aid, claims that the sacks are simply being reused, but as you can see, they appear to be sealed. Detergents, shampoos, lotions, hand creams, lipsticks, and eyeshadow fill one aisle in the market. Almost all of this comes from China. North Korean defectors say that there are almost no consumer products manufactured in North Korea anymore, except for a cheap lye soap. And in markets the world over, there is bargaining and shoplifting. The sellers in the market tend to be women because men are not allowed to quit their state factory jobs. Those inside the main market are licensed by the state. These licenses, which you'll see many vendors wear pinned to their clothing, cost more than $100. That's a fortune for a North Korean. So many people sell illegally. Outside the official market is the even larger unofficial market. Money changes hands over wooden carts that can be rolled away in a hurry. Those who can't afford carts sell on tarpaulins laid out in the dirt. Other vendors have fashioned boutiques using poles and clotheslines. The clothes from China are bright and garish. You'll see even pink and paisley items on sale. In the old North Korea, people wore brown and indigo blue. The rail yards near the market are the backdrop for makeshift eateries set up by women in the streets. Bowls of soup cook over charcoal stoves. Hand-crank blowers keep the fires burning hot. The customers squat at tables built from wooden planks propped on buckets. Since there are no taxis in Jongun, some people make carts and hire themselves out as porters to transport goods. I'm told that many of these people are homeless and sleep on the carts at night. Others cut hair or fix bicycles, although these jobs are supposed to be controlled by the government's Convenience Bureau. Almost every family in Jongun is involved with the market economy in some way. They have to be, since the state-controlled jobs pay only the equivalent of a few dollars per month. This is a dramatic change from the old North Korea. As one woman told me, it's not the same old North Korea, except in name. This is Barbara Demick in Seoul for the Los Angeles Times.
This video is a bit old, but I think it's pretty much the same from what I've seen. The North Koreans are very strict about not allowing anybody to photograph or video markets. And these videos were provided by a North Korean-run NGO that's in Japan. And they actually send small cameras in. And you'll see sometimes very jerky cameras. People will attach them to bags or bicycles and then take the camera out. I have hours and hours of market footage, some of it a little bit newer, but I think that is the most telling of what it's like. When I've shown that video to people who are familiar with North Korea, they're very surprised. Others are not, because it looks very much like a market in China. I mean, a market in a, not in a very, third-rate little city by the border. It really is like a Chinese system now. And I'm told that you can get almost anything in North Korea. I think despite the sanctions, that's still true. There's an 800-mile border between North Korea and China. and merchandise is smuggled back and forth. Again, in the larger quantities, it's handled by state trading companies, military trading companies, but there are still individuals who go back and forth, and that's how people get, for example, DVDs had been very popular. Now it's usually brought in on memory sticks. But in the North Korean system, you're not allowed to watch foreign television. You're not really allowed to watch foreign movies. Soap operas, all that stuff is banned. But people bring it in anyway. And it's actually very corrosive to the North Korean system. The most popular item in North Korea, entertainment-wise, are South Korean soap operas. And what people, North Koreans, love to see is, maybe it's a soap opera about a South Korean bus driver or a factory worker, but they'll see his kitchen, and they'll see this kitchen might have a bowl of fruit and a refrigerator, and a bag of rice and a flat screen TV, and there'll be a mobile telephone, and they think my God, look how those people live. And that's one of the reasons that the North Koreans are very concerned about smuggling of DVDs and memory sticks. To see how South Koreans live is just devastating to North Koreans. I'm told that you get in more trouble smuggling a South Korean soap opera into North Korea than you do pornography, because pornography, frankly, deadens the mind. These South Korean soap operas open the mind. And this has been one of the great difficulties for the North Korean regime. In some ways, like other countries, they're struggling with globalization. They need to globalize. They need to open up their economy. They need to bring in, foreign capital. They need to bring in foreigners. But when they do that, their people see how others live. North Korea is not the poorest country in Asia, but it really is, kind of a black hole surrounded by Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, increasingly China. Northeastern China is not a wealthy part of China, but the difference between China and North Korea is huge. And when I've met North Koreans who've traveled back and forth, they say they're, amazed when they get to China and they see that people in China, eat rice every day. Rice is a luxury. They eat rice 3 times a day in China. And North Koreans I've met in China, one woman told me that she got to China and all she ate was apples because she loved apples and she'd only had apples a few times in her life, even though North Korea actually has great apples. They produce apples, but they're not available to common people. They're only, really available for export, or if you have, money to buy them at a high price in a market like this. And so she just ate apples. It's interesting what's happening right now because we have sanctions against North Korea, and in a way, they're not working because of this market system. Eventually, I think they will. They're, certainly preventing NGOs from bringing humanitarian supplies into North Korea. But so far, I think, from what I've seen, there's various North Korea economic watch sites. The price of rice has remained stable. Fuel prices have gone up. But it just keeps on humming along. And I think it's really marketization that's allowed the economy to, relatively speaking, prosper. The North Korean economy apparently grew by 3.9% in 2016. It was one of its best performances in, I think, 16 years. This was reported by the South Korean Bank, which follows the economy in North Korea and makes reports. And it's just this strange situation that during this sanctions and economic isolation, North Korea is actually growing. And I think that's the result of, again, marketization economic liberalization under Kim Jong Un, who has not instituted any political reforms. To the contrary, people can be executed for very little in North Korea. I would not say the human rights situation has improved. I would not say there's more political freedom, but there's certainly more freedom to shop and to sell and to get out of your day job. We're all waiting to see what effect sanctions, increased sanctions will have on the North Koreans. In general, when there's been, a harsh sanctions regime, the people tend to suffer more than the elites. The elites somehow get whatever it is they want. Kim Jong-il apparently had a taste for cognac and was at one point supposedly the largest importer of Hennessy into the country. Kim Jong-il was also like a famous foodie. He brought in a sushi chef from Japan, and he'd send people to France to buy certain kinds of cake and cheeses and wines. But for regular people, I think they still live, kind of on the edge. I mean, North Korea has not been in a state of famine since the 90s, but people do live very poorly. And I mean, you could see the situation in that video, which again is old, but from what I've seen of life in this city, this is Jongun in the Northeast, it's not improved much. People eat usually one meal a day. They have very little heat in the winter, very, very poor clothing, very poor shoes. And it will be interesting to see what happens. The UNICEF has been warning that many children will die as a result of the increased sanctions. I read about one NGO that was trying to bring in sort of sanitary kits for tuberculosis patients, and the kits were blocked because they had nail clippers in them, and they're not supposed to have any metal. I know some of the embassies have had a hard time getting money in, but yet the elites somehow seem to get in what they want. And these borders, this big border with China, is well guarded by North Korean military, by Chinese military, but if there is corruption, what they really want to get in, if it's weapons parts, they will get it in. So I'm not very optimistic about the effect of sanctions. Something that has been very effective, people keep on asking me, like, what should we be doing to pressure the North Koreans? Something that has been very effective have been sanctions imposed by the Treasury Department. They've blocked some North Korean banks from doing business in the international banking system, which is really US run. They've also blocked some Chinese banks that have dealt with the North Koreans. And that's been really very effective at reining in North Korea's bad behavior. Obviously, diplomacy. In the past, other US administrations have offered the North Koreans some kind of deal, and the deal would involve North Korea freezing its nuclear and missile programs in return for economic aid. What they most need is not just food, but energy. And in the past, there was a deal that fell apart where the North Koreans were going to get 2 light water reactors in return for freezing their nuclear program. And light water reactors, the engineers could tell me more, apparently that cannot be used to generate weapons-grade plutonium. That's why they were allowed. That did not work. That deal fell apart. But I think many of us are still hoping there will be some kind of arrangement because, I'm sure people will ask about this, but an attack on North Korea could just be devastating for Northeast Asia. in all sorts of ways. North Korea is the North Korean border, DMZ, runs 35 miles north of Seoul, and any kind of tit-for-tat shooting war could really cause a lot of deaths in South Korea. The South Koreans are really vulnerable that way, and you're not even talking about nuclear weapons here. The North Koreans have so much conventional artillery at the DMZ that they could really wipe out a lot of Seoul, especially the northern part of Seoul, without using anything but conventional weapons. At the same time, any kind of North Korean provocation really hurts the South Korean economy. This is part of the story of the Olympics. South Korea has this large, developed economy. They have a stock market, and the North Koreans just say boo, and the South Korean stock market falls, and people get nervous about traveling to South Korea. It threatens their whole investment structure, and there's a saying that we hear a lot in China, which is the barefoot man doesn't fear the man with shoes. There's a sense that North Korea is so desperate that they will do anything. They could do anything, and the man with shoes, which is in this case South Korea, is the one that stands to lose. And this is again a part of the arrangement. When the Korean Peninsula was divided, the line was drawn around the 38th parallel, which goes just above Seoul. And we were talking about this over lunch. I don't know how many people know this story, but it was the end of World War II when Japan surrendered and Korea had been occupied by the Japanese. And in the US, they were looking at this Japanese colony that nobody really knew very much about and saying, like, what are we going to do? And there was tremendous fear that the Soviets were going to occupy all of Korea. So they decided very hastily to divide it into a Soviet sector and an American sector, and taking a National Geographic map, two State Department officers, one was Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State, they just drew this line, which became more or less, it changed somewhat, the demarcation line when the Korean War ended. It shifted a bit, but not that much. And the Americans wanted to keep Seoul, the capital, in their sector. So that's why it's so close. And it's just this very volatile situation. The South Koreans, I think, feel that they're sort of held hostage here in a dispute between the US and North Korea. I mean, it's a funny way to look at it, but South Koreans and North Koreans are really kind of the same people. And almost everybody has a relative on the other side. And there's a lot of sort of pan-Korean sentiment. And I think the South Koreans worry if something starts, they're the ones who are going to suffer. And I think they're correct in that assessment. The time that I lived in South Korea, which was 2001 to 2006, there was quite a bit of cooperation between South Korea and North Korea. It was the so-called Sunshine Policy that was introduced by Kim Dae-jung. He was the president of South Korea, and he won a Nobel Prize for going to Pyongyang and meeting with Kim Jong-il. And his idea was to help the North Koreans enough to bring up the North Korean economy to the South Korean level, or at least close the gap. The economic difference between North and South Korea is something like 20 times greater than it was between East and West Germany. at the time of reunification. And there's just no way of putting these two countries together. They are so different now. Their languages are different, especially among the younger generation. In my book, I give a figure among North Korean defectors. The 18-year-old males are 5 inches shorter than their South Korean counterpart. And that's because of poor nutrition in the North, and even more so, really improved Western-style nutrition in South Korea. And it's hard to imagine these two economies merging at any point. I think with the sort of this rapprochement with the Olympics, if it lasts, I think you'll see a lot more economic support from South Korea for North Korea. The South Koreans really don't want North Korea to collapse. In fact, it's often said that the South Koreans are more afraid of North Korea collapsing than of it invading. They don't really believe that the North Koreans are going to invade South Korea again. I mean, South Korea is twice the size and 20 times the economy. I mean, they can't swallow South Korea. They know it would be the end of their system. But they worry that if North Korea collapses, that will mean 22 million hungry cousins, coming south, wanting food and housing and taking their jobs. And that thinking motivates South Korean policy to a large extent. South Korea knows sometimes that they're propping up North Korea, but they're hoping against hope that somehow this system will change, and that eventually North Korea will do a China-style transformation that improves their economy. And this is what the North Koreans are hoping too. Kim Jong-il used to travel to China every so often, and each time they thought, he's going to see how China has done it and bring us along the same path. I'm not sure exactly why they haven't done it, but the North Koreans are, afraid that if they open up their economy, it's going to open up the political system. And, again, this is part of their dilemma. In order to maintain a totalitarian system, you need to have total control, which means you have control over people's food, their housing, their clothing, their education, everything. And as you marketize, that system erodes. And that's what Kim Jong-il was fearing when he said, markets breed egotism. That again is the big quandary for the North Koreans. So I don't know that they're going to open that quickly. Kim Jong Un has adopted a policy he calls Byungjin, which means like kind of parallel, and it's build the military and build the economy at the same time. And a lot of critics say that's impossible because if you're building the nuclear weapons and you're building the missile systems, there's going to be sanctions and nobody's going to invest in the economy. I don't know how true that is. They've gotten a lot of investment from Egypt, Russia, even China. It's gotten stricter in the last year. I mean, the Trump administration has really taken a policy, as Nikki Haley has said, if you sell to North Korea, you risk your ties to the US. So they really are enforcing things more. But North Korea seems to be skirting around the sanctions and finding their own way. And maybe they don't really need the US. That's part of their thinking. But in any case, they are growing. Their economy is doing pretty well, all things considered. Anyway, I'll take questions.
Education
Yeah, good question. They actually have an excellent education system. This is something people don't realize. North Korea had almost 100% literacy in, I think, the 70s and early 80s before South Korea. And it's a controlled, it's a very controlled economy, and it's a controlled education system. And if you're a young man or a young woman who excels at math and sciences, you will be plucked right out of your little town and given, a very high level of instruction. And, I don't know, you have any Korean exchange students here? I mean, South Korea, on the East Coast where I live, there's a lot of South Korean exchange students, and they are good at math. Both Koreas have a really top-flight math and engineering program. Also computers. I've met some computer types, some IT experts in North Korea, and they are very good. They're extremely elite to be allowed to do IT, but they're talented, and they've invested a lot in the sciences and math. And also with the military, the North Koreans put their money into the development of weapons of mass destruction. They don't really care if those 1 million enlisted men are on the verge of starvation, and many of them are. Many of them are. I mean, people tell me that their sons come out of the military and they're on the verge of starvation. They'll often release them when they're starving to death to keep them from dying in the military. But the money goes into developing those weapon systems. And they have knockoff iPads, and obviously they're doing a lot with hacking. They've hacked into the Bitcoin system. They've hacked South Korean banks. They hacked Sony Pictures. Their cyber capabilities are very strong. Exactly. And there was this emerging middle class in North Korea, and it's mostly made up of people who are working in the market. I'd say those people they're certainly not elite, and they may come from poorer families, but they're people who've figured out the system. And you probably noticed all those women, all the people working there were women, mostly women over 40, and that's who's running things.
What are they investing in? And is like Western powers like America, are they scared of that, seeing these major countries investing?
They're angry. They're angry. Well, Egypt, for example, there was an Egyptian telecom company called Orascom, and they built the mobile telephone system in North Korea. They got mobile telephones around 2008, I guess it was. And that was all done by the Egyptians, and they were also redeveloping some real estate in North Korea. And I mean, I just read like the Moldovans were selling wine to North Korea. I mean, there's all sorts of business deals. The North Koreans also have guest workers in Europe and Russia and China. This has been a big issue with the sanctions. North Korea has this large, well-trained workforce, and they send them abroad to work, and they're kind of like slaves because most of their salaries go to the regime. But there were North Korean workers in the Czech Republic and in Poland. I did a story, about 10 years ago about North Korean workers in the Czech Republic. They were working in like an Italian shoe factory. It was so strange, but they'll supply these workers, and then 90% of their salary goes back to the regime. Now, under the newest round of sanctions, that's no longer allowed, and some of these workers are being sent home.
If some of the military are even on the verge of
No way. I mean, there's no ability to organize in any way at all. One of the people in my book, a young man actually who did IT, said, he tried to start like a reading club in university. They were just going to get together and discuss great books. It was not allowed. You can't get any group together. It would be quashed immediately. And they also have this system of familial guilt. And if you do anything against the regime, it's not just you who's punished, it's your whole family. And one of the women in my book, she was a kindergarten teacher, she said, a lot of people feel like if you had one life to give to get rid of this terrible regime, you would do it. But do you really want to condemn your nieces and your nephews and your parents? And it's been very effective. So I don't see any kind of upheaval emanating from the emerging middle class. I would see the possibility of an internal coup in the leadership. And I think that's why you see somebody like Jong Un, who's very young. He wasn't even 30 when he took power, when his father died. And he's been ruthless. He's had his own uncle executed. He had his half-brother murdered in Malaysia last year. There have been large numbers of executions of people in the military. There was one guy who was executed after falling asleep in a meeting. Is anybody sleeping here? I think there were some. He's really been tough, but I think it's because he needs to keep his power among the elite. And he's also done, many things to improve the living standards of the elite. I should have brought some more videos, but if you see newer videos of Pyongyang, they've built these, at least from the outside, very attractive apartment complexes. They've built this dolphinarium, and there's like a skating park. There's all sorts of things designed for the elite, especially for scientists, going to your question about the sciences. And they need to keep those people happy so that they don't defect or try to launch a coup. Because there was a lot of unhappiness under Kim Jong-il that he was not willing to open up the economy. I mean, people do want economic growth. The North Koreans are not stupid. They're isolated, but they can see what's happened in China. They certainly know that South Korea is much wealthier. And so Kim Jong-un, I think, needs to deliver to his own people, but the people meaning the elites.
Do you think that Kim Jong-un's more relaxed attitude towards those capitalist marketplaces that you're showing us is due to this education?
I don't know, I hadn't really thought about, maybe, possible. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know, but he's in a way much gutsier than his father was. I think there used to be an assumption, at least the China watchers thought this was the great China fallacy, that when you have economic freedom, you have political freedom, and it has not been the case in China, and it's not the case in North Korea. I think he thinks as you can give people more economic freedom, but you need to crack down politically in order to keep control. So, but I don't know about that.
Yeah, so for some of us who are interested in professional academic research, are you aware of any organizations that collect data, either survey data, interview data, even what estimates on the Jongun market activity? I'm aware of the North Korea Database Center, but I'm just curious if you know of anyone else collecting information on
North Korea Economic Watch, Curtis Melvin's outfit is really worth reading. Yeah, it's open source. You don't have to pay for it. Curtis Melvin, he's in Virginia, and just called North Korea Economic Watch. Before I spoke to you today, I was reading the latest on it. They collect articles about the North Korean economy from other sources, and then there's a couple of premium services that you have to pay for. NK Daily is one, and 38 North. There's a couple of specialty services on North Korea.
So you mentioned that a lot of South Korean policy is dictated based on a fear that collapse would, cause mass immigration to South Korea. Do you see that fearful sentiment portrayed in how South Koreans treat North Korean defectors in the country?
Yes, I do. I think South Koreans are really very frightened of North Koreans, and again, not of them attacking, but they see South Koreans as, kind of themselves 40, 50 years ago. And, there's a lot of racism in South Korea, and they look at them as, smaller and darker, and South Koreans can be very, weird about North Koreans. And I think each defector, is a reminder of, the 22 million or now 25 million others who are up there. I don't think they see so much mass immigration as people, with needs. They're close by, those North Koreans. And, South Korea is a, kind of nouveau riche country. They were poor themselves, and I think they're a little bit embarrassed by North Koreans. There's this weird thing between North and South Korea. I mean, the North Koreans or the South Koreans, they're like this embarrassing poor cousin. If your cousin comes from, I don't know, where, and they're like, wearing crappy clothes and have a terrible accent and haven't washed in a while, and you think like, oh my God, do I have to take care of this? That's I think how they feel about them. When in the early 90s, when North Koreans first started coming to South Korea as defectors, each time there'd be a big defector, it was like, they were like a rock star. Everybody was really curious. But now there's a lot of defectors in South Korea, and the South Koreans are kind of sick of them, and they're very resentful that the North Koreans get money. And when I was there, it was about $20,000 to resettle. It wasn't, okay, that may look like a lot to you, but if you had to rent an apartment in South Korea, it's not that much. But they get money and training, and they get some preferential admission to universities, and there's a lot of resentment of that. And I don't know. They have this terrible fear of collapse. And when I was living in Seoul, Kim Dae-jung was still president, and he had been, I don't know if you know much about him, but he had been, a great, a dissident and an activist, and he had lived in exile for many years, and he had lived in Berlin after the reunification of Germany. I had also lived there around the same time, and he felt, I remember I spoke to him about this personally, he felt that the reunification of Germany was so costly and so devastating to the Germans, and that the South Koreans couldn't afford that, and that part of his sunshine policy was based on the idea of helping the North Koreans stay in North Korea, building their economy where they were.
If I might add, that one is also a bit of a generational shift. As the generation that remembers the 70 years back when the war ended, as that generation, which still has those relatives in North Korea, dies off, the younger generation of course doesn't care as much anymore. There's, again, 70 years back, our older two vets are gotten off, our three more vets are gotten off. We don't remember it either. Even there, they have less knowledge of the actual people there. And so as that generation dies off, there's less interest in helping people.
I would agree with that. I used to do man on the street, vox pop interviews with young South Koreans, and I remember doing one story about do you want reunification, and everything in South Korean propaganda is always about reunification too. It's Tongil, it's reunification. When we're all one people, blah blah blah, and the lead of my story was what is his name, was like, Lee Min-suk has never met a North Korean and never hopes to meet one, because they're just not into it. They think anything that reduces their standard of living isn't worth it. And in fact, I found young South Koreans sort of, embarrassed and unwilling to talk about North Korea. It was like this, big elephant up there, something embarrassing. And often when there were dinner parties in South Korea, the foreigners we'd always be talking about North Korea, what's happening, when's it going to collapse, blah, blah, blah. And the South Koreans would just like walk out of the room. They'd be in the next room and they'd be talking about movies or real estate or books or music, but anything but North Korea. They just, didn't want to be reminded of it.
Okay, so you said that the people of South Korea treat North Korea as like the embarrassing cousin. What about the political elites? Will they want a unified Korea if the Kim regime falls, or will they want to keep North and South separate, just like kind of like close political ties?
I went to a academic seminar a couple of years ago on what happens if North Korea collapses. And I think the thinking was that they would have to be separate for some years, maybe 20 years, because they're so different now that you couldn't just put them together, and that there would be, a period of time where North Koreans couldn't come south without special permission. South Koreans couldn't go north without permission. That it would be very, very limited and a gradual opening up. And that would be as much to protect the South from the North as vice versa. We were saying, all the South Koreans would like go up there and buy all the real estate and, think, I'm going to invest in Pyongyang, it's cheap. And you just couldn't put them together immediately. But there's very, South Korea is a democracy and people have very differing views. I mean, they're, I think, as polarized as we are in the US. And conservatives were in power for most of the last 8 years. Now there's a more progressive government, and that government, I think, wants to keep North Korea afloat. So.
So China and Russia both want to get their hands on Iraqi port. How many years down the road do you think that's going to be moving in that direction?
Oh, I think that the ones who really want the Rajan port are the Chinese, because that part of China is, this is for people who don't know, it's a small port in the far northeast, very close to the Russian border. The Russians already have sea access there, but China is kind of landlocked, and the Chinese really want that port.
So for the Russians, they're actually got a lot of bauxite and silver in the winter, and it's a military port, from what I understand. And so they've already built their port there. The Chinese are still in the process of, they bought the land, but they just haven't decided to build it up yet.
Well, they had coal shipments. The Chinese had coal shipments going through Rajan, but
The Russians and
yeah.
Chinese were sold a war section that they could build up themselves.
I've always, if you look, we kind of need a map here for people who don't intimately know that corner of Northeast Asia. But if you look at the map, I've always thought that the ones who would really benefit from a unified Korea are the Russians. And people say to me, why is there no unified Korea? And I think it's because nobody's really wanted a unified Korea. The South Koreans are afraid of the cost of supporting the North Koreans. The North Koreans know that North Korea is full of propaganda about unification, but they know that unification means the end of their system. The Chinese are worried that there will be a US-dominated country on their border. The Japanese, my God, do not want a unified Korea. They're afraid of a unified Korea. The US, some will argue that the US feels if North Korea collapses, they won't have a reason to keep their troops in South Korea. It's very cynical. the Russians. The Russians, I think, North Korea is like this big, we were talking about economics, is like this big dead end between, blocking the Russian Far East, blocking northeastern China. It's really, it's an economic dead weight.
I want to bring us back a little bit to a more micro view. What are North Koreans who have defected to South Koreans doing there in terms of like their livelihood? And you said they started coming there in the 1990s, so now I imagine there's some children who kind of came there as children are now raising adulthood. Is there any sense of how those kids are integrating into society and how they're doing?
What do North Koreans do? Oddly, a lot of them run restaurants. The earlier generation ran restaurants. The North Koreans are very good cooks. They had the reputation of being like the better cooks in the Korea. So there's, among the earlier generation of North Koreans, a lot of them are in food services. The younger North Koreans have actually had a hard time. There's this famine generation. Most of the defectors they're not from Pyongyang, they're from, very poor parts of North Korea. And they're shorter than the South Koreans. They're not as well educated. Although they did have a good education system, these people were not among the elite, and it's been very difficult for them to catch up. I've found, oddly, older people have done better. Like my woman, Mrs. Song, who was about 60 when she defected, she did really well in South Korea because she grew up sort of with the same kind of food as the South Koreans. She wasn't more deprived, she wasn't less educated, so she adjusted very well. But those people who were starving in utero and as babies have a hard time competing. And the ones also who come as like young adults in their 20s and 30s and already have careers have a hard time adjusting. Another guy who I mentioned who was doing IT, he's in my book. He was a very elite student. He came out in, what year was it, like 2004, 2005, and he had never seen the internet when he came out. He said he went to he defected into China. He went to an internet cafe and he was like amazed. And he's working as a pharmacist in South Korea. He's very intelligent, but it was just too hard for him to catch up.
How do they earn hard currency, foreign currencies for trade purposes?
There are these North Korean trading companies that dominate a lot of the import and export with China. Tourism, they do get tourists. These guest workers are a big source of hard currency. And they have a lot of, North Korea has a lot of exports. Now they've been blocked by sanctions, but they have coal, they have other minerals, they have seafood. North Korea has some of the most unpolluted waters in Asia and very good seafood, and they sell a lot of seafood to China.
What do you think well, you mentioned earlier that it would take 20 years for Koreans to fully unite or speculation. What do you think the Chinese reaction would be to a coup in North Korea or the fall of the Kim regime? Would they be on board with this gradual reunification?
I think the Chinese would do what the Chinese always do, is they would wait to see who the winner is and support them. The Chinese are very pragmatic that way, and that's what they've done in the Middle East when their friends were toppled. They just wait and see. But I think they would not want a US-dominated North Korea, and that's part of the issue. We haven't. I'm glad nobody's asked about what happens if there's a war in North Korea and North Korea collapses. But I think the most difficult part could be, even if North Korea collapses, who goes in. And, many of us have thought if North Korea collapses, there could be a sort of a Syria type of anarchy with different factions fighting and, kind of a proxy war with China, the US, certainly Russia supporting different factions. Could be very messy.